The footage from that evening at Maison Lumiere has been viewed over 47 million times, shared across every continent, and discussed in countless articles about what happens when wealth collides with wisdom. The viral clip shows Marcus Thorne, the billionaire hedge fund manager worth an estimated $14 billion, sliding a worn piece of parchment across a white tablecloth toward a young waitress named Layla Hassan. What the video captures next, her measured response, his escalating fury, and the devastating revelation that followed, has become a touchstone for conversations about dignity, assumptions, and the hidden depths we fail to recognize in the people who serve us. But the full story, the one that unfolded over the course of 3 hours that November evening and the 18 months that followed, contains layers that no 30-second clip could ever convey. It begins not with the confrontation itself, but with the two lives that converged that night, each carrying histories that would make their collision inevitable. Layla Hassan had arrived in New York City 7 years before that fateful evening, carrying a single suitcase and a doctorate in Semitic languages from the University of Damascus, where she had graduated at the top of her class at the age of 23. Her dissertation on the evolution of classical Arabic script in medieval trade documents had been published by Cambridge University Press and remained the definitive text in her field, cited in over 400 academic papers across 3 continents. She had been recruited by Columbia University to join their Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, offered a tenure-track position with a starting salary that would have provided comfortable living in the city she had dreamed of inhabiting since childhood. But 3 weeks before her scheduled departure from Damascus, her father suffered a catastrophic stroke that left him paralyzed on his left side and unable to speak. Her mother, Fatima, a retired school teacher who had spent 40 years educating children in their neighborhood, found herself suddenly responsible for round-the-clock care of a man who had been the family's primary breadwinner. Layla's younger brother, Karim, was still completing his engineering degree in Berlin on a scholarship that barely covered his living expenses. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Someone needed to earn money immediately, and someone needed to be present in New York to establish the foundation for eventually bringing her parents to America, where her father could receive the specialized neurological care unavailable in their war-torn homeland. Layla had written to Columbia explaining her situation, asking if she could defer her position for 1 year while she stabilized her family's circumstances. The department chair, a kind woman named Dr. Patricia Hoffman, had responded with genuine sympathy, but explained that budget constraints made deferral impossible. The position would need to be filled immediately, or not at all. And so Layla had made the choice that would define the next 7 years of her life. She took a job as a waitress at Maison Lumiere, one of Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurants, where the average dinner check exceeded $800, and the tips from a single busy Saturday night could equal a week's salary at many professional positions. She told herself it was temporary, a bridge to something better. She would work nights, study for the additional certifications American universities required, care for her parents remotely through video calls and wire transfers, and eventually find her way back to academia. The first year became 2, then 3, then 5. Her father's condition required multiple surgeries. Her mother developed arthritis that made the caregiving increasingly difficult. Karim graduated and found work in Munich, but his salary barely covered his own expenses in that expensive city. The wire transfers continued month after month, year after year, while Layla's dreams of returning to scholarship receded like a tide that never came back in. But Layla had never stopped being a scholar. During her lunch breaks, she read academic journals on her phone. On her days off, she visited the Columbia Library as a guest researcher, a status Dr. Hoffman had quietly arranged for her, allowing access to databases and rare manuscripts. She corresponded with colleagues around the world, offering translations and consultations, sometimes for small fees that supplemented her income, sometimes simply for the joy of engaging with the work she loved. She had published 3 more papers during her years as a waitress, each one under a pseudonym because she could not bear for her former colleagues to know how far she had fallen from the trajectory they had all expected for her. The pseudonym she chose was N. al-Rashid, and within certain academic circles, N. al-Rashid had become something of a legend. A mysterious scholar who seemed to appear from nowhere with brilliant insights, who never attended conferences, who never revealed their identity, but whose work on medieval Arabic manuscripts had revolutionized several subfields. Only Dr. Hoffman knew the truth, and she kept Layla's secret with the discretion of a true friend, hoping that someday circumstances would allow this remarkable woman to reclaim her rightful place in the academic world. At Maison Lumière, Layla was known simply as an exceptionally competent server. The restaurant's manager, a meticulous Frenchman named Jean-Pierre Dubois, had recognized immediately that she possessed an intelligence and composure far beyond what the position required. But he had learned long ago not to pry into the circumstances that brought overqualified individuals into service work. New York was full of such stories. Actors waiting for their break, writers finishing their novels, scholars like Layla caught in circumstances beyond their control. What mattered to Jean-Pierre was that Layla never forgot an order, never lost her composure with difficult customers, never failed to anticipate what a table needed before they asked for it. She had become his most trusted employee, the one he assigned to the most demanding guests, the one who could handle the billionaires and celebrities and diplomats who frequented their establishment with grace and professionalism that put even the most seasoned servers to shame. Marcus Thorne had built his $14 billion fortune through a combination of genuine financial acumen, ruthless deal-making, and a willingness to exploit legal loopholes that more ethically minded investors avoided. His hedge fund, Thorne Capital Partners, had delivered average annual returns of 23% over the past 15 years, making his investors extraordinarily wealthy and making Marcus himself one of the most sought-after money managers on Wall Street. He lived in a penthouse on Central Park West that had been featured in Architectural Digest, owned homes in Aspen, the Hamptons, and the south of France, collected contemporary art with the veracity of a man trying to purchase a soul he feared he might have lost somewhere along the way, and surrounded himself with people whose primary qualification was their willingness to agree with everything he said. His first wife had left him after 12 years, taking their 2 children to London and citing in divorce proceedings his fundamental inability to recognize the humanity of anyone he perceived as beneath him. His second wife, a former model named Christina, who was 30 years his junior, had lasted 4 years before fleeing to her parents' home in Sweden, reportedly telling friends that living with Marcus was like living with a very wealthy robot who occasionally malfunctioned into cruelty. Marcus had not remarried after that. He had instead doubled down on the persona that brought him success in business, the dominant alpha, the man who was never wrong, the force of nature who bent the world to his will through sheer conviction and financial might. The parchment that Marcus brought to Maison Lumière that evening had been in his family for generations, passed down from his great-grandfather, a merchant who had done business throughout the Mediterranean in the early 20th century. Family legend held that it was a letter from a medieval sultan, a document of enormous historical significance that proved the Thorne family's connections to royalty and power stretching back centuries. Marcus had recently become obsessed with tracing his genealogy, hiring researchers to construct an elaborate family tree that would establish his lineage as something more distinguished than the reality. His great-grandfather had been a moderately successful importer of textiles. His grandfather, a factory owner in New Jersey. His father, a real estate developer who had given Marcus his start in business with a small loan of $5 million. But Marcus needed to believe he came from greatness, that his success was the expression of superior bloodlines rather than the combination of luck, timing, and a willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The parchment was central to this fantasy. He had shown it to several historians who specialized in Islamic manuscripts, but none had been able to provide the translation and authentication he craved. Some had suggested it might be a forgery. Others had simply admitted the document's age and deterioration made definitive analysis impossible. Marcus refused to accept these answers. He was convinced that with the right expert, the document would prove everything he wanted to believe about himself. He had come to Maison Lumière that evening with two guests, Frederick van der Berg, a Dutch art dealer who handled many of Marcus's acquisitions, and Simone Chen, a museum curator who had been cultivating Marcus as a potential donor for her institution's new Islamic art wing. They were seated at the best table in the house, the corner booth with views of both the main dining room and the private garden beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jean-Pierre had personally escorted them to their seats and assigned Layla to their table, recognizing that Marcus Thorne's reputation for being demanding with staff required his most unflappable server. The evening began smoothly enough. Marcus ordered a 1982 Chateau Margaux that cost $4,000 per bottle. He sent back the first pour because the temperature was a fraction of a degree too warm, a complaint Layla handled by apologizing gracefully and having the sommelier re-chill the bottle for precisely the amount of time Marcus specified. He interrogated her about the provenance of the Dover sole, the specific farm that had supplied the vegetables, the name of the fisherman who had caught the seafood, questions Layla answered with a level of detail that surprised even Frederick and Simone, who exchanged glances at this waitress who seemed to know more about the restaurant's supply chain than most executive chefs. It was during the main course that Marcus produced the parchment. He had been describing his genealogical research to his companions, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention in any room he occupied. "My great-grandfather received this directly from a Moroccan prince," he was saying as Layla approached to refill water glasses. "It's a letter from Saladin himself, confirming a trade agreement with my ancestors. I've had it authenticated by 3 separate experts, but none of them speak Arabic well enough to provide a proper translation." This was not true. The experts had declined to authenticate the document and had expressed doubts about its provenance. But Marcus had long ago lost the ability to distinguish between the reality of events and the version of events that served his ego. He glanced up at Layla as she poured water into his glass. "You wouldn't happen to know anyone who reads Arabic, would you? I've been looking for a proper translator for months." Layla's hand remained steady as she finished pouring, though something flickered in her eyes that a more observant man might have noticed. "I read Arabic, sir," she said simply. I'd be happy to take a look if you'd like. She had not intended to reveal this. She had learned over 7 years to keep her qualifications hidden, to avoid the uncomfortable questions that arose when wealthy patrons discovered their server had more education than they did. But something about Marcus's casual dismissal of the experts who had already examined his document, the way he blamed their supposed linguistic limitations rather than acknowledging their professional judgment, had irritated her in a way she couldn't quite suppress. Or perhaps it was simply that she had not looked at a medieval Arabic manuscript in months, and the scholar in her was hungry for engagement with the work she loved. Marcus looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been told his Mercedes could be repaired by the parking valet. Amusement, condescension, and a flicker of something that might have been offense at the presumption of a servant thinking she could help with a matter of historical significance. "You read Arabic," he repeated, his tone making clear this was not a question but an expression of disbelief. "What, a few phrases for ordering food?" "I'm talking about medieval classical Arabic script. This document is over 800 years old." Frederick and Simone shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the condescension in their host's voice, but unwilling to challenge him. The art dealer had too many pending deals with Marcus to risk his displeasure. The curator was too close to securing his donation to jeopardize the relationship. They said nothing as Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly with the particular pleasure he took in putting people in their place. "I appreciate the offer, sweetheart, but this requires someone with actual expertise, a doctorate, years of specialized training. I've consulted with professors at Harvard and Yale who couldn't fully decode this. I somehow doubt a waitress from... Where are you from originally? Syria? Lebanon? Has the qualifications to handle a document of this significance." The restaurant had grown quiet. Other diners were glancing toward the corner table, drawn by the carrying quality of Marcus's voice and the tension that had suddenly electrified the air. Jean-Pierre, standing near the host station, felt his stomach tighten with the familiar dread of a scene about to unfold. He had seen Marcus Thorne reduce servers to tears before, had watched him berate sommeliers over imaginary flaws in perfect wines, had witnessed him demand managers be fired for the crime of failing, to accommodate his impossible standards. But he had never seen Layla lose her composure, and he clung to the hope that her remarkable equanimity would carry her through whatever was coming. Layla set down the water pitcher with careful precision on the side station. Her face betrayed nothing, not offense, not anger, not even the mild irritation that any person might feel at being spoken to in such a manner. When she spoke, her voice was measured and professional, the voice of someone who had learned to navigate far more dangerous situations than the ego of a wealthy man in an expensive restaurant. "I have a doctorate in Semitic languages from the University of Damascus, sir. My dissertation was on medieval Arabic manuscript traditions. I've translated documents for the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm happy to examine your parchment if you'd like a professional opinion, but I understand if you'd prefer to wait for someone whose credentials you find more convincing." She delivered this information without pride or defensiveness, simply stating facts as one might state the evening's specials or the composition of a sauce. Then she picked up the water pitcher and turned to continue her rounds, leaving Marcus Thorne staring after her with his mouth slightly open and his companions exchanging looks of barely concealed amazement. For a moment, the table was silent. Frederick Vanderberg, who had dealt with wealthy eccentrics throughout his career in the art world, recognized immediately that the dynamic had shifted in a way Marcus would find intolerable. Simone Chen, whose work at the museum had taught her to read power dynamics with precision, saw the same thing and braced herself for the eruption she knew was coming. Marcus's face had passed through several colors. The initial flush of surprise, then the deeper red of embarrassment, and finally the mottled purple that indicated genuine rage. No one spoke to Marcus Thorne that way. No one made him feel foolish in front of his guests. And certainly no servant, no waitress, no insignificant employee whose entire purpose was to bring food and disappear had the right to possess qualifications that exceeded his own and to reveal them in a manner that made his earlier dismissal seem exactly as ignorant as it was. "Sit down," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying across the entire restaurant. Several heads turned. A couple near the window paused mid-bite, forks suspended in the air. Jean-Pierre began moving toward the table, his professional instincts screaming that intervention was necessary, but Marcus silenced him with a raised hand. "I said sit down," he repeated, pointing at the empty chair beside Simone. "If you're such an expert, prove it. Translate this document right now in front of witnesses, and we'll see just how impressive your credentials really are." He pulled the parchment from its protective sleeve and slapped it onto the white tablecloth with the casual brutality of a man who had never been taught to handle precious things with care. Layla had stopped walking. She stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats. 4. 5. The restaurant frozen around her as if holding its collective breath. Then she turned back toward the table and walked to the chair Marcus had indicated. She did not sit. Instead, she stood over the parchment, her eyes moving across the faded script with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays before an operation. Her silence stretched for nearly a minute, an eternity in the hushed dining room, while Marcus drummed his fingers on the table with increasing impatience. And Frederick and Simone watched with the horrified fascination of witnesses to an unfolding accident. When Layla finally spoke, her voice was pitched only for the table, forcing the eavesdropping diners to strain forward in their seats. "This is not a letter from Saladin," she said quietly. "The script is approximately 300 years too late for the Ayyubid period. This appears to be late Ottoman, probably early 19th century based on the calligraphic style and the condition of the parchment. Additionally, Saladin's court correspondence was conducted in a specific chancellery hand that bears no resemblance to what we see here." She touched the edge of the parchment gently, turning it slightly to catch the light from the table's candle. "More importantly, this isn't a letter at all. It's a merchant's receipt. It records the sale of 17 bolts of Damascus silk to a buyer whose name appears to be—" She squinted at a particularly faded section, Yusuf ibn Ibrahim, almost certainly a fabric trader operating in one of the major souks. The seller's name is partially illegible, but the amounts and the business terminology are quite clear. She straightened and met Marcus's eyes with perfect equanimity. "It's a lovely historical artifact, probably worth a few $1,000s to the right collector of Ottoman-era trade documents. But it has nothing to do with Saladin, and it certainly doesn't establish any connection to medieval royalty." The silence that followed was absolute. Frederick Vanderberg was staring at Layla with unconcealed respect, his art dealer's instincts recognizing genuine expertise when he encountered it. Simone Chen was mentally revising her assessment of the evening. This was no longer a simple donor cultivation dinner, but something far more interesting. And Marcus Thorne was experiencing an emotion he had not felt in decades. The visceral shock of being publicly, undeniably, comprehensively wrong. His face had gone pale beneath its careful tan, his jaw working silently as he processed the demolition of the fantasy he had built around this piece of parchment. The document that was supposed to prove his noble lineage was a receipt for fabric. The waitress he had dismissed was a scholar whose expertise exceeded that of the professors he had name-dropped. And everyone in the restaurant, everyone, had witnessed his humiliation. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media, discussed in management seminars and articles about workplace dignity, and cited in legal proceedings for months to come. Marcus Thorne, unable to accept the reality of his mistake, did what he had always done when confronted with information that threatened his self-image. He attacked. He swept the parchment off the table with a violent motion that sent it fluttering to the floor. He stood so abruptly that his chair crashed backward into the wall. And he advanced on Layla with his finger jabbing toward her face, his voice rising to a shout that echoed through the crystal and linen of that elegant room. "You're a liar," he bellowed. "You're a fraud. You come into this country illegally. You take jobs from real Americans, and now you have the audacity to mock me in front of my guests? I'll have you deported. I'll have this restaurant shut down. I'll make sure you never work anywhere in this city again." Layla did not step back. She did not flinch. She stood exactly where she was, her hands clasped loosely in front of her apron, her expression composed, her eyes meeting Marcus's with a steadiness that seemed to infuriate him further. "Sir, I am a naturalized American citizen. I have worked legally in this country for 7 years. I have provided you with an accurate translation of your document based on my professional expertise. If you disagree with my analysis, you're welcome to seek other opinions, but I would ask that you lower your voice and step back to a respectful distance." But Marcus was beyond the reach of reasonable requests. He was in the grip of the particular madness that afflicts powerful men when their power proves insufficient to reshape reality to their preferences. He grabbed the front of Layla's blouse with one meaty hand, twisting the fabric in his fist, pulling her toward him with the physicality of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted without consequence. "Who do you think you are?" he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath hot with wine and rage. "Who the hell do you think you are?" 3 things happened simultaneously. Jean-Pierre began running toward the table, his carefully maintained composure finally breaking. A woman at a nearby table raised her phone, already recording, and Layla Hassan, who had remained calm through insults and dismissals and threats to her livelihood, responded to being physically grabbed by a man who outweighed her by 100 pounds in the only way that seemed appropriate to the moment. She spoke, but her voice was no longer the measured, professional tone of a server attending to a difficult guest. It was the voice of Dr. Layla Hassan, the author of The Evolution of Classical Arabic Script in Medieval Trade Documents, the mysterious N. al-Rashid, whose work had revolutionized her field, the woman who had sacrificed 7 years of her career to care for her family while never losing sight of who she truly was. "My name is Dr. Layla Hassan. I am the world's leading expert on medieval Arabic manuscript traditions. Your document is not valuable, your assumptions about me were incorrect, and your behavior tonight will have consequences that no amount of money will be able to prevent." She did not raise her voice. She did not struggle against his grip. She simply spoke truth with such absolute conviction that it seemed to pass through Marcus like an electric current, freezing him in place. And then Jean-Pierre was there, with 2 servers behind him, physically separating Marcus from Layla apologizing profusely to the other diners, calling for security to escort Mr. Thorne from the premises. Frederick and Simone remained at the table, witnesses to a disaster they would describe to colleagues for years to come. The woman with the phone had captured everything. The grab, the confrontation, the words that would be quoted in headlines around the world. Within the hour, the video would begin its journey toward 47 million views. The consequences for Marcus Thorne began immediately and continued for 18 months. The video's viral spread brought with it the worst possible form of modern judgment, the court of public opinion, whose verdicts are swift and whose penalties are unlimited. Within 48 hours, 3 of Marcus's largest institutional investors had requested meetings to discuss concerns about judgment and reputation. Within a week, Thorne Capital Partners had experienced redemption requests totaling $4 billion. Clients who could not risk their own reputations by association with a man now internationally known for assaulting a waitress who had correctly translated his worthless parchment. Marcus's lawyers attempted damage control, issuing statements claiming the video had been taken out of context, that the physical contact was exaggerated, that Dr. Hassan had provoked the confrontation through her unprofessional behavior. These claims collapsed when the full video emerged. 37 minutes recorded by the restaurant's security system showing Marcus's escalating abuse from the moment Layla first approached his table. Simone Chen, the museum curator, quietly withdrew from discussions about Marcus's potential donation, explaining to her board that accepting money from such a source would compromise the institution's values. Frederick Vanderberg, more pragmatically, continued working with Marcus for another 3 months before the reputational damage made the association too costly for his gallery. One by one, the pillars of Marcus's social world crumbled. He was disinvited from charity galas, dropped from the boards of philanthropic organizations, quietly removed from the guest lists of the events where the wealthy gathered to reassure themselves of their virtue. His remaining investors, the ones who had not fled, in the initial exodus, found themselves explaining to their own clients why they continued doing business with a man whose face had become synonymous with entitlement and cruelty. The legal consequences were equally severe. Layla filed assault charges, which were documented by video evidence and witnessed by dozens of patrons and staff. Marcus's lawyers negotiated aggressively, attempting to settle out of court with confidentiality agreements that would have silenced Layla in exchange for substantial payment. But Layla refused. She did not want his money. She wanted something far more valuable: accountability. The criminal case proceeded through the New York court system with all the visibility that Marcus's fame and Layla's newfound celebrity guaranteed. He was convicted of third-degree assault and sentenced to community service, a slap on the wrist that nevertheless entered his permanent record, a stain that no amount of philanthropy or reputation rehabilitation could ever fully remove. The civil lawsuit was more consequential financially. Layla sued for damages including lost wages, emotional distress, and defamation for Marcus's false claims about her immigration status. A jury, after watching the security footage and hearing testimony from expert witnesses who confirmed Dr. Hassan's credentials, awarded her $2.3 million in compensatory and punitive damages. Marcus's lawyers appealed. The award was upheld. He wrote a check that represented less than 1 hour's interest on his remaining fortune, but the symbolic defeat was far more damaging than the financial one. Layla Hassan's life transformed in ways she had never anticipated. The publicity surrounding the case brought her work to the attention of people who had never heard of N. al-Rashid, or her contributions to the field of Semitic languages. Columbia University, specifically Dr. Patricia Hoffman, reached out with a renewed offer. Not the assistant professor position that had been unavailable 7 years earlier, but a full professorship with tenure, accompanied by a public statement from the university about their commitment to recognizing expertise, regardless of the circumstances that had temporarily obscured it. Layla accepted. She would begin teaching the following September, finally taking her place in the academic world that had always been her true home. But she did not simply walk away from her years in service work. She understood that her experience had given her insights that purely academic scholars often lacked. Insights into the way wealth distorted perception, the way society devalued certain forms of labor regardless of the intelligence and skill they required, the way credentials mattered far less than confidence, and the willingness to speak truth to power. She incorporated these insights into her teaching, designing courses that explored the intersection of knowledge and status, expertise and recognition. Her students adored her. Her colleagues respected her. Her father, watching from Damascus through video calls that occurred weekly without fail, told her that this was what he had always known she would become, not just a scholar, but a teacher who understood that wisdom was nothing without the courage to share it. Marcus Thorne's trajectory moved in the opposite direction. Thorne Capital Partners continued operating, but with a shadow over its reputation that affected everything from recruitment to deal flow. The young analysts who once would have competed for positions at his fund now whispered about the video and wondered what it said about the culture there. His returns, while still respectable, declined from their historic averages as the stress of perpetual reputational management distracted him from the focus that had made him successful. He became more isolated, more bitter, more convinced that he had been the victim of a conspiracy of political correctness and immigrant advocacy rather than the architect of his own downfall. His children, now adults living in London with their mother, quietly distanced themselves further. His social circle contracted to a small group of loyalists who shared his grievances without challenging them. 2 years after the incident at Maison Lumière, Marcus Thorne sat alone in his Central Park West penthouse, watching the sunset paint the trees below in shades of gold and crimson. The parchment, the worthless receipt that had started everything, sat framed on his wall, a reminder of his humiliation that he could not bring himself to discard. He had paid $25,000 to have it authenticated by a different expert, hoping for a different verdict. The second opinion had confirmed everything Dr. Hassan had said. Late Ottoman, commercial transaction, historically minor, certainly not connected to Saladin or any medieval royalty. He had destroyed the second report and kept the first authentication he had commissioned years earlier, the one that told him what he wanted to hear, even though he now knew it to be false. In a classroom at Columbia University, Dr. Layla Hassan was explaining to her graduate students the significance of a particular calligraphic style in determining the provenance of medieval manuscripts. She described the way letter forms evolved over centuries, the way a trained eye could detect forgeries through anachronistic details, the way historical truth revealed itself through patient analysis rather than wishful thinking. Her students took notes, asked questions, and occasionally glanced at the framed newspaper clipping on her office wall, the one showing her face above the headline about the verdict, her eyes calm and steady, her expression the same as it had been that night when she stood her ground against a man who believed his wealth entitled him to her deference. The woman who recorded the video on her phone that evening had become something of a minor celebrity herself, interviewed on talk shows about what it felt like to capture such a moment. She described the split-second decision to start recording, the way her hands had trembled as she realized she was witnessing something significant, the rush of sharing the footage and watching it spread across the world. She had never met Layla Hassan personally. She was simply a diner who happened to be in the right place with her phone ready, but she felt a connection to the story that would never fully fade. Sometimes, when she saw Dr. Hassan's name in academic publications or news articles about her teaching, she felt a quiet pride in having played a small role in bringing this remarkable woman the recognition she deserved. Jean-Pierre Dubois continued managing Maison Lumière, which had experienced a significant increase in reservations following the incident. People came hoping to sit at that table, to be served by that waitress, not understanding that Layla had left for her professorship, or that the table was simply furniture without meaning. He handled these requests with the same grace he brought to all aspects of his work, seating curious tourists at the corner booth and allowing them to imagine the drama that had unfolded there. He never spoke publicly about that evening, but in private moments, when colleagues asked what Layla Hassan had been like to work with, he always said the same thing. She was the best server I ever employed, and the best person. I knew from the first day that she was meant for something greater. I was only surprised it took the world so long to see what was obvious to everyone who knew her. The parchment itself, the humble merchant's receipt that had catalyzed such extraordinary events, eventually found its way to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Layla had negotiated its donation as part of the civil settlement, insisting that Marcus give the document to an institution where it would be properly preserved and studied. It now resides in the museum's Islamic art collection, displayed in a small case with a placard that explains its origins, a 19th century trade receipt, notable primarily for its connection to a famous incident of misidentification and the scholar who correctly identified it. Visitors occasionally stop to read the placard, recognizing the story, pausing to consider how an object so minor had become so significant through the events that surrounded it. And in Damascus, in a small apartment where a man who had suffered a stroke 7 years earlier slowly regained pieces of his speech through relentless therapy. A father watched his daughter's lectures online, streamed through the university's public access portal. He could not speak clearly enough to tell her how proud he was. He could not write the letters he wanted to send, but he watched. Every lecture, every public appearance, every interview she gave about her work and her experience. And sometimes, when the words finally came to him, stumbling and imperfect but carrying all the weight of a father's love, he would say to his wife, "She did it. Our Layla did it. She became exactly who she was always meant to be." Fatima would nod, wiping tears from her eyes, and together they would watch their daughter stand before students and colleagues and the world, teaching truth with the same quiet dignity she had shown on that November evening when a billionaire demanded she prove her worth, and she had responded by being simply and completely herself.